Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 43rd week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussant tonight is David Green and perhaps David Johnson. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who has been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page of News from Neptune, where you'll find comments from viewers, not all unadulterated praise, and some answers from us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. It's October 24th. On this day in 1929, the New York stock market crashed. It was Black Thursday, the traditional understanding of the beginning of the Great Depression. And on this same day, in the year 2008, called Bloody Friday, many of the world's stock exchanges experienced the worst declines in their history, with drops of around 10% in most indices. That was 2008. You can see why October has the reputation of being the cruelest month rather than the one the poet had in mind, if you're into equities. It's important, though, I think, to talk about the situation when the great crash of 1929 occurred, because the historical development of American capitalism since the Great Depression has lessons for us, it seems to me, of the first order, particularly on the issue that we've talked about here frequently at News from Neptune, and that is the growing and accelerating inequality in neoliberal America over the last 40 years. The stock market indices, and even more importantly, some other economic indices, are good indications of what's happened. Perhaps the most important one is called the Gini coefficient, not as in the bottle, but Gini, named for an Italian proto-fascist economist, Corrado Gini, who in 1912 published a paper entitled Variabilità e Mutabilità, and you see why I'm having trouble learning Italian. And in this paper, he set up a statistical way to judge equality in a society. Did some other things too. It was a statistical technique, and the math is really quite elegant. But what he does is set up an index of a society on the basis of who owns how much of the society. So to speak, to put it this way, the index runs from 0 to 1, with 0 being a situation in which the wealth of the society is perfectly divided. Everybody has an equal share. That's 0. There haven't been many 0 Gini coefficient societies, as you can imagine. As the coefficient grows, and this has to do with the integral calculus you had trouble learning in college, as the coefficient grows, you reach a position of 1.0, in which one person in the society owns everything and everybody else has nothing. Well, you can imagine that for any existing society, the index is somewhere between 0 and 1. And the index changes over time as ownership in a society, ownership of wealth, varies. In the world today, the country with the lowest Gini index, that is the index that suggests that things are as well divided, better divided than in any other country in the world, that, in other words, most equality in wealth exists in that country. The country is, surprisingly enough, Japan. At the other end of the scale at which wealth is most poorly divided, we find, of course, the United States and one or two African countries. This is important. It's also important as to what's happened to that index in the history of the United States since the stock market crash of 1929. The index, if you were to chart it from 1929 to 1969 to today, in other words, 40-year increments, you would find a chart that was U-shaped. At the top in 1929, just before the Great Crash, the Gini index was as high as it has been in history. By 1969, as a result of the Depression, the New Deal, and the war, and the post-war readjustment of the American economy, which is a story we don't tell much, but is really quite important. By 1969, we had reached the greatest degree of equality of wealth in the American society. In other words, the Gini index was at its lowest point in history. Now, what's happened in the next 40 years, in the last 40 years, in other words, from 1969 to today, is that the index has swung back up again to the point it was in 1929 when the stock market crashed. That's what 40 years of neoliberalism has done. It's produced an increasingly unequal society in terms of the division of wealth as measured by the Gini index. This is a political fact of the first order. And our masters, by the way, are quite aware of it. The American ascendancy is quite worried about a society in which growing inequality will finally lead to social unrest and is looking for ways to handle that. But that's the situation we find ourselves in today. So you are watching news from Neptune, the Genie into the Bottle edition. And we'll start with David Green.
No one else to start with today.
Yeah, no one else.
Lots of.
We'll get the genie out of the bottle, maybe.
Lots of things to talk about, and we can, indulge some spontaneous, relatively spontaneous comments. I guess I'll start with something that I wrote that was published in the paper, I guess last week. That I had a letter that I had written in response to a full-page ad taken out by a retired member of the econ department faculty here at the U of I, a guy named Jim Hines, A. James Hines. I hadn't known much about A. James Hines, but when I Googled him. This ad, by the way, was in support of Phyllis Wise. Instead of a full-page ad full of about 200 or 300 names, it was a full-page ad with a small picture of Phyllis Wise, donated by Jim Hines. I was curious as to find out who Jim Hines is, and when I Googled him, I found out that he was on a website called sciencecorruption.com. And the reason he was on that website was that they pointed out, they claim that he is an economist at the U of I who was retired now, but who was here for many years and still lives in Champaign, that he was this is the wording that was used on the website sciencecorruption.com, that he was part of a cabal of scientists and economists and other social scientists who were hired by the Tobacco Institute back in the early 70s, beginning in the early 70s, to produce research that supported the claims the tobacco industry that smoking is not harmful. And I'm not an expert on this topic, and I'm not an expert on Jim Hines, but I included that comment in a letter that I wrote to the newspaper that was published last week. I quoted from the website the word cabal, which was from the website, and what happened in the translation of my comment in sort of typical current right-wing fashion, that if you can define someone as a conspiracy theorist, you discredit them.
Right.
So the title of the letter, supposedly likely written by Jim Dye, the editor who's been so visible lately in the News Gazette in relation to the case of Stephen Salida and other happenings. The title that was given was something to the effect of right-wing cabal controls U of I, or something like that, taking the word cabal that I had quoted from this website. So my letter continued on in my research on Jim Hines to find out that one of his mentors here at the U of I is a fellow named Julian Simon. And Julian Simon is a name from way back that I heard many years ago, didn't know much about him, really couldn't have put much of a finger on him. But in looking up Julian Simon, who died about 15, 16 years ago, he was an economist at the U of I who was also very useful to right-wing perspectives and neoliberal perspectives as they evolved in the 1970s and 80s through the Reagan era. Because what they needed, and this was part of the whole rise of think tanks and the various products from right-wing and so-called centrist think tanks that so dominate the discourse especially about wealth and poverty, and this what you've been referring to, Carl, in terms of neoliberalism. What Julian Simon was saying back then was that he developed a theory that the more resources we draw from the earth, the less scarce those resources become. And this apparently was a very popular theory among some people back then. And in my letter, I referred to Julian Simon. I tried to sort of, in my conspiratorial mode,
yes.
I linked Jim Hines to Julian Simon, and I linked both of them to the kind of background of right-wing theories that have not necessarily been dominant at the U of I, but that have been prominent, especially something called, especially a theory of law that has been that was generated at the University of Chicago and drifted down here along with Milton Friedman and so forth, a theory of law called the law and economics sort of school of theory, which basically sort of free market theories that we identify with, and that are so useful to explaining why it's a good thing that the rich become richer,
yes.
and that why it could only be good for the poor if only the poor would get off their duff and actually do something. and so we have a whole not just think tank background, but a whole academic background for misunderstanding how the economy actually works, how wealth inequality actually has increased all these years. That is certainly just as dominant, if not more dominant, if not clearly more dominant in the departments of economics and political science and sociology, at the law school, of course at the business school, and the various aspects of the business school. We have this whole mentality, and a fellow wrote a letter that was published a few days ago. A student of Julian Simon who still lives in the area wrote a letter defending Julian Simon against my charges, again raising the issue that I was a conspiracy theorist, that I was spinning a conspiracy, that this right-wing cabal was running the university and was and all this of course relates to the context I'm trying to create for understanding what's going on around here that leads to the whole Saleda affair, or Saleda scandal as it's being called now. So I guess I just wanted to raise the issue of what we do on the left with these charges of conspiracy theorists. And when you make a charge that claims that there's people out there who are in think tanks, who are in university departments, who publish things, who have ideas about things, and who have clearly crackpot ideas about things, as this idea that the more you take out of the earth, the less scarce that thing becomes. I mean, there's different ways of looking at that in terms of different resources, but I don't think there's any doubt that when we take fossil fuels out of the earth, not only can they not be replaced, they despoil the environment. So this is what we deal with when we try to describe what it is that's going on ideologically on this campus.
It's worthwhile, I think, too, to remember that the charge of conspiracy theory is always an interesting notion because conspiracy literally means, of course, a breathing together. It means that somebody is planning to do something, someone is trying to do something, and obviously there are conspiracies. People do try to do things politically and otherwise. Some of the notions that are conspiracy theories, of course, are false. It's not the case that the American ruling class meets for dinner every Thursday night and sits around a guttering candle flame and tries to decide what to do with the American economy. It is the case that the increasingly narrow American ascendancy, what the Occupy Wall Street people called the 1%, do have things in mind and have worked very hard in order to get those things done. What we call neoliberalism, the general political mood of America of the last 40 years, was a conscious counterattack to the 1960s, to the democratization movements, not just in regard to the war, but also in regard to the economy, to education, and so forth. The counter-revolution conspiracy of American business against that press for democracy that the 60s really were has been remarkably successful. They've won on all fronts. Both modern political parties in the U.S. are neoliberal parties. They differ in what are primarily what the business world calls product differentiation. The reason why Coke and Pepsi can run ads trying to suggest to you that one is better than the other, when in fact they are remarkably similar. You have to look for ways to differentiate this particular product. Well, that's where the Republicans and Democrats are now, of course, with the more important proviso that both parties, as neoliberal parties, have moved substantially to the right from where they were when the neoliberal counter-revolution began. And so today, a liberal Democrat is probably a bit to the right of where a moderate Republican was in the 1970s. This is a conspiracy that's worth imagining. We should note too, I think, David, that the universities have been particular and indeed almost early on and early adopters of the neoliberal conspiracy. I think you, in fact, were being a little gentle through the University of Illinois a moment ago. When we reflect on the history of the University of Illinois in the 1950s and 60s in terms of promoting right-wing economic ideologies. A scandal in the economics department in the 1950s arose because some people in that department were so temerarious as to suggest that John Maynard Keynes should be paid attention to if one wanted to reestablish the American economy. You couldn't have that sort of talk going on in a land-grant university, right? You know, we've got a long history of that. You're watching News from Neptune. We've been joined by David Johnson, and I want, before I forget, to ask David about, to ask Mr. Johnson about the interesting programs he has coming up for the weekend.
Well, tomorrow on Saturday, we're having a special double feature on the World Labor Hour, 90.1 FM and at WFT.org. We're having Stephen Saleta in the first half hour. He's the professor who was hired by the University of Illinois and then fired because he made personal tweets on his own time, not at work, as far as criticizing the government of Israel's bombing of Gaza and killing civilians. And it turned into quite a controversy. And in fact, I believe the Illinois Attorney General is now involved about some emails that Chancellor Weiss seems to have lost and can't find. So that'll be real interesting. The second half of the program, we have James Kilgore, another person that was very much mistreated, to put it mildly, by the University of Illinois, and Brian Dollner talking about the local No New Jails campaign here in Champaign County, as well as the militarization of the police.
That's 11 o'clock Saturday morning?
That's 11 to 12 noon Central Time, yes.
And you're also doing an interesting program here on Sunday on UPTV, right?
That's
David?
right. We're also doing a Skype telephone interview with Stephen Saleta, and that'll be broadcast here on Urbana Public Television on Labor's Worldview TV on Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. The first half of the hour will be the interview with Stephen Saleta. The second half will be a Labor Beat production in which Stephen Saleta and another gentleman from the Palestinian Electronic Intifada were filmed up in a conference, or actually it was a presentation at the University of Chicago several months ago. Quite interesting, very well done DVD.
I'd also like to mention that there's this Saleta controversy at the University of Illinois is, as Mr. Green has pointed out before, part of a campaign that encompasses all of American academia right now, in which censorship is being exercised over academics. I almost think that you're giving away too much, Mr. Johnson, when you talk about Stephen Saleta tweeting on his own time as if he had been doing it on university time, or as a university professor, it would somehow be justified for him to be fired for them. I don't think that's true. What we have in the Saleta case is an egregious violation of academic freedom being the right of a member of a faculty to say and do what seems best to him without censorship on the part of the institution for which he works. Now, that's an ideal, and an ideal that has been notably contravened in the American Academy throughout the 20th century. I mean, back in the First World War, horrible examples of this sort of censorship, well through, of course, the Vietnam period, where it was egregious, and on down to the present. I mean, in some ways, you have to have hung around American universities for as long as I have to be aware of just how profound these violations of academic freedom are and how consistent they are. Academic freedom is a facade. It's a claim that's observed in the breach in the American Academy and always has been. This particular case right now comes up only because of the counter-campaign by supporters of the State of Israel to make sure that their embattled position is not challenged on American campuses. So I would put Salaita into a context of serious violations of academic freedom in the American Academy, literally for generations, now being played out on at the little university down the street here. And we should be aware of it, whether we're involved with the university or not.
Yes, and you know what's really insidious about this, Carl, is I'm giving away a little bit of the Labor Beat DVD that'll be aired on Sunday. But they point out in the DVD that this is there's a concerted, focused campaign being done by the government of Israel and its supporters.
Right.
In fact, it's termed the David Project, embarrassingly
How
to say.
appropriate for us.
In which basically they consider the future of Israel's public image in the United States and hence future U.S.-Israeli relations that that'll be made and broken, either made or broken, actually in universities. And the campaign is specifically targeting various professors and even students. As far if they have any kind of criticism of the policies of the government of Israel, that they will be targeted. And what's interesting is that it's even specifically said that they won't. The reasons they'll target them and have them dismissed or brought up on some kind of punishment of some sort won't be specifically what they said, but instead they'll question their academic competence or some other type of excuse to sort of put a smokescreen on the real reasons that they're being sanctioned.
I remember a piece that Noam Chomsky, our intellectual mentor for this program, wrote years and years ago. He was talking specifically about the Vietnam era, in which Chomsky, of course, who spent his academic life, spent his adult life in universities as well, said casually, everybody knows how it's done. Some young professor whom the institution wants to remove doesn't use the right research method or quotes the wrong materials or comes to the wrong conclusions, and therefore his tenure is denied. He says it's a self-sealing system, the tenure system itself, and it's designed precisely to keep a complacent academy. And in the Salaita case, they made the mistake of giving him tenure to bring him here, to bring him to the University of Illinois to teach, and therefore they had to find another way to undermine it, a way that was so crass that even the Illinois Attorney General noticed. So, yeah, we're dealing with a remarkable thing. There's a second aspect of this, too. And our own David Project, I think, helps to see that. The point that David Green has mentioned frequently when we've talked about this matter is that it fits into the corporatization of the university, well underway at the beginning of the 20th century, but taking new and unlooked for forms in the beginning of the 21st century. It's the corporatized university, and with the University of Illinois, unfortunately, in the vanguard, that is the occasion for, or the locus for, this particular violation of academic freedom. And both things need to be brought together here. That is, the campaign to silence critics of Israel, but also the corporatization of the university, as David has been discussing.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's been two events recently. Excuse me.
Who do you think you are, Mario Rubio? What is this?
Yeah. There's been, I don't know what's, excuse me.
Certainly.
Yes. There's been a couple of events recently which out-of-town speakers who are boycotting the campus have spoken at the Independent Media Center, and they've been part of panels. First was Catherine Franke about 3 weeks ago. Last night was a fellow named Bruce Robbins, a literature professor from Columbia, who came to speak at the Independent Media Center to a somewhat smaller and less spirited crowd at the Independent Media Center last night. but had some good things to say about what he calls the new McCarthyism, not necessarily a phrase he made up, but certainly applies to this. But in the case of both of these panels, in both, there were good respondents. I agree with most of the things that were said. People were eloquent and passionate, and I had a lot of good things to say about this. I don't see them tying in really what's going on to what's really going on this campuses, and in relation to what you rightly refer to as the corporatization or the neoliberal corporatization of higher education in this country. So I think that is something that I think the reason I was a little bit dispirited last night is because I want to see this rhetoric broadened, and I want to see it. And as it is broadened, I think that people will get more of an idea of what can actually be done. I'm a little miffed when I hear defenders of Stephen Salata talking in terms of the prestige of the university, how this incident has lowered the prestige, how it's gonna make it difficult, how it's gonna make it a kind of laughing stock. Well, what's going on here is no different. It's a difference in quantity but not quality in terms of what's going on in other places. There's McCarthyism at many other places, and in all these places it takes place in the context of dense ties. This is what has not been raised at these fora in the last few weeks. The dense ties between university researchers and Israel in the areas of science and technology, in the areas of weapons and militarizations, of computer science and various things that make this a much bigger issue than just freedom of speech or academic freedom.
Yes, I think that's quite true. And we sometimes forget that the student anti-war movement of 50 years ago began with an objection to the corporatized university. The free speech movement at Berkeley, as you mentioned here before, David, was a movement precisely against what the university had become in the early 60s, and the people who were speaking at Sproul Plaza were insisting that they had a right to speak about political matters here, and they were being prevented from doing so by a university that had sold to the corporations under a new term, multiversity, by the president of the University of California. Now, you have to, as I say, have lived in the universities for these years to understand how profoundly frightened the university, with its corporate clients, was by the uprising against the Vietnam War that did indeed begin on the campuses. And what we sometimes forget is that universities have spent more than a generation making sure it doesn't happen again. And that's why something like the Salata affair can be so explosive on this campus. There's such an attempt to suppress it because the university authorities and their corporate masters are afraid of what it might lead to. We hope their fears are well placed. You're watching News from Neptune. There are many things on our plate here. David Johnson, do you have a particular topic you wanted to bring up today?
Yes, I do actually, Carl. Last night, my wife and I went to the Art Theater in downtown Champaign and saw the film Kill the Messenger about Gary Webb, the reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, which broke the story called Dark Alliance was the title of it, and it basically documented how the CIA was actually helping Contra terrorists who had been formed, armed, and trained by the Reagan administration to violently overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua during the early 1980s, throughout most of the 80s, and how the CIA basically allowed and maybe in some cases helped the Contra-terrorists actually import cocaine to the United States to sell, to make money, and then to buy arms, because the U.S. Congress had voted to cut off funding for these Contra-terrorists. And anyway, Gary Webb, he documented this real well. I mean, this basically was a period of time that he reports on is when the crack cocaine epidemic hit the country, and the people he was basically investigating were part of this, where the epicenter of it was, which was Los Angeles. Anyway, very well done film, and what's interesting in it is it really shows how the corporate media is basically comes to the defense of the CIA and the military-industrial complex and the 1%. In the case of Gary Webb, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post in particular, basically ganged up and just destroyed Gary Webb. I mean, resulting in him eventually committing suicide in 2004 because he couldn't get hired as a journalist once he lost his job at the San Jose Mercury News. But it's really interesting because the Washington Post just recently did a review of the movie, and they didn't learn anything from this. I mean, you'd think that they would have been all sorts of mea culpas. Basically, we're sorry we had it wrong, but instead, they basically say they were right, and Gary Webb was not a good journalist. This guy, Jeff Lean, well, one thing I want to mention is at the time when Gary Webb published his story, Dark Alliance, the internet was just coming into use, becoming more common, let's put it that way, in 1996. And fortunately, his article was posted on the internet at that time, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why he's so remembered and you can still access the story. But anyway, at that time, the Washington Post, the managing editor, actually had been an intern for the Central Intelligence Agency back before he became editor of the Washington Post. But this Jeff Lean, who's the Washington Post's assistant managing editor, begins his renewed attack on the late Gary Webb's Contra cocaine reporting with a falsehood. Lean insists that there is a journalistic dictum that an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary proof. But Lean must know that it is not true. Many extraordinary claims, such as assertions in 2002, 2003, that Iraq was building nuclear weapons, had weapons of mass destruction, they'd got yellow cake uranium from Niger, and they were basically in the process of developing nuclear weapons. What did the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times do in that case? They believed everything that was told them by the Bush administration, not requiring any kind of proof, much less extraordinary proof. And I think this is actually from an article by Robert Perry, who at the time worked for Knight Ridder newspapers, and he was one of the few journalists in the country that came to Gary Webb's defense. But in this article you can get on the internet if you want, is about the movie Kill the Messenger. Robert Perry goes into more about Jeff Lean of the Washington Post's hatchet job on the film, and Gary Webb as well. And it's really interesting because he continues by saying that a different rule actually governs American journalism, that journalists need quote-unquote extraordinary proof. If a story puts the U.S. government or an ally in a negative light, but pretty much anything goes when criticizing an enemy or somebody who the 1% of the United States or the corporate elite doesn't like. And I really would like to recommend, it's interesting too, more recent examples. If, for instance, the Washington Post wanted to accuse the Syrian government of killing civilians with sarin gas, or blame Russian-backed rebels for the shooting down of a civilian airline over Ukraine, any scraps of proof, no matter how dubious, would be good enough, as was the actual case here, just in the last year or two. And Robert Perry does a really good job of debunking this guy for the Washington Post, Jeff Lean. And if you get a chance, unfortunately, the film is its last showing is tonight at 7:30. So if you're watching, it's already started. Yeah. But when it starts to come out in DVD, or you get a chance to go be in another city where it's still making the circuit around the country, I highly recommend you check out the film. Very well done, and very much sticks pretty close to the actual story.
Talk about the journalistic aspects of this. I mean, in some ways, I would say that Robert Perry is making too narrow a claim, so to speak, by criticizing this fake notion of journalistic ethics he finds in the Washington Post. Look, the Washington Post has always been the CIA's favorite newspaper. The present owner of the new owner of the Washington Post, is also a major client of the CIA, Jeff Bezos of Amazon.com. So the situation is even worse now than it was in all the years when the Graham family owned the Washington Post, and busily did whatever they were asked from Langley, up to and including having retired, and the word is a technical term in regard to the CIA, retired CIA agents as regular columnists and editors. CIA paper was thoroughly impacted. Sorry, my mistake is correct. The CIA paper is called the Washington Post. Now, there are some problems here that need to be sorted out if we're going to say some things about American journalism. One is this notion that the CIA is a rogue agency off doing strange things by itself. The CIA is certainly doing strange things, as we've recently found that other agencies of the federal government, like the NSA, are doing, but they're not doing them by themselves. They're not doing it as a rogue agency. This is part of the American government. This is part of the executive branch. This is exactly what they have in mind. Now, the criticism of the Washington Post should be a good deal more sweeping, a good deal more profound. I might say that one of the best sources for the story that the movie David is talking about tells is our friends at Counterpunch. At the time Gary Webb was publishing his material, practically the only defender he had in the American press was the late Alexander Cockburn, who began writing about the press for the Village Voice in the 1970s. Counterpunch, the archives of Counterpunch, has a great deal of information about Webb, about the CIA's cocaine plots, and about the highly illegal support for the Contra-insurgency. It's remarkable enough that it was illegal, but it was. But that didn't stop, of course, the American government from continuing to terrorize this country. Like one of the few clear definitions of terrorism that we have from the United Nations referred to what the U.S. was doing in regard to Nicaragua. So we're talking about consistent policy here, and the tragedy of Gary Webb was that he exposed it. He exposed this, wait for it, conspiracy.
Yes,
as
and,
it surely
I
was.
wanted to, we were talking about conspiracies before you arrived, David, and I just wanted to reiterate that point. The manner in which Gary Webb was discredited or tried to be discredited by the mainstream media was by accusing him of being a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
He was quite careful not to attribute, this was going on in LA, in California, in LA at this time. Apparently there's a movie coming out about the main crack cocaine dealer in LA at that time, a guy that was known as Freeway Rick Ross.
Yes. Yeah.
Apparently there's a documentary film coming out about him also. But Gary Webb was careful not to attribute a conspiracy at the CIA to get blacks in LA on crack. He was careful not to make it that conspiratorial. He was just trying to show that, and he did show that the CIA knew that the Contras were using the crack trade to fund their attacks on the Sandinista government. So again, we find this, and I think one thing that's really behind all this that has to be, it's put crudely, but I think truly, is that when you hear the word conspiracy, invoked by those trying to discredit theories like this, what they're denying, what they're really ultimately denying, is that there are powerful forces at work, and that there is class struggle at work here. The conspiracy does operate at the basis, at the level of class struggle. It doesn't, as you said, operate because people have to get into rooms, into smoke-filled rooms, and figure out how to get people on drugs. It does happen because the relatively few people who run the country and run the world know what their interests are and what needs to be done.
When I hear the word conspiracy, I reach for my search engine. Got to find out what's really going on there against that's being dismissed as conspiracy. Get the real story. That's the important point.
You know, the thing about there's conspiracy theory and there's conspiracy fact, and you know, it's like I've noticed this phenomena since the 9/11 attacks is that now it seems like thanks to the corporate media, it's done a pretty good job. It seems like they've convinced a lot of people out there that anytime somebody brings up anything, no matter how well documented it is, about collusion with government or corporate officials or wrongdoing, they automatically say, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. You're a conspiracy theorist. You know, and as if rich and powerful people don't talk to each other. Give me a break. As if there's never been collusion and even conspiracies, illegal acts, which is basically an illegal act involving 2 or more people. Give me a break. I can give you a long list of history going back, you know, even just 50 years to show that there's been plenty of cases of that. And one in particular is this whole thing with the CIA being involved in the cocaine trade in order to finance the Contra-terrorists, and they were terrorists. Anyone who attacks agricultural extension stations and hospitals and tortures and kills men, women, and children, I'm sorry, but that's, to me, a pretty good definition of a terrorist. Not like somebody, well, I should say, like our government describes, they've been using the term quite loosely in the last few years, describing anybody they politically disagree with as a terrorist, even if they haven't used any kind of violent acts. Perfect case in point is the animal rights movement. The animal rights movement is considered by the FBI to be America's #1 domestic terrorist threat. I mean, these are people that break into laboratories and agricultural factory farms to free animals and never have killed anybody or harmed any individuals. They've done some property damage, but that's supposed to be a terrorist compared to, in the case of the Contras, where they actually murdered men, women, and children. So anyway, just to keep this perspective in mind, but as far as getting back to my main point, this is not the first time the CIA is involved in the drug trade. The Church Committee hearings in the mid-1970s had verifiable proof that the CIA was involved in the heroin smuggling trade in Vietnam. There's a film with, what's his name, Mel Gibson, called Air America. Of course, it's a little, it's a comedy film. But Air America was actually the name of the airline that the CIA used to smuggle heroin from Laos into Saigon to be opium from Laos into Saigon to be processed into heroin, and then shipped back to the United States, oftentimes in the cadavers of dead GIs. And this has all been confirmed. It was a Senate committee hearing which brought this testimony to light. So this is nothing new as far as CIA activity. In fact, in recent years and in the past, it seems like anywhere the CIA is involved in its dirty deeds, you'll find just a burgeoning drug trade. Another case in point is the invasion of Afghanistan. Prior to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, Afghanistan provided less than 10% of the world's heroin supply. Now, almost 90%. I mean, this is, you know, these are not conspiracy theories. These are facts. Go Google it. I mean, don't take our word for it.
The whole background for this is in the book that you referred to, Carl Whiteout, by Jeffrey St. Clair and Alexander Coburn, which was published, I believe, in 2000 or 2001, or maybe 99. So, and the Gary Webb story is the first chapter of that book. I guess only one caveat, just to bring in a little wrinkle into this. I think one of the ways the anti-conspiracism canard works, or one of the underlying aspects of it, is that if you are a conspiracy theorist, if you are a left-wing conspiracy theorist, you are also associated with being an anti-Semite. There's always the reason it's so important that Israel stay in this picture. The reason that the Jews and Jew hatred hatred of Jews stays in this picture is because it's part of this context in which people can be accused of being not just conspiracy theorists, but anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists if they in any way implicate that there are any Jews at all involved in any of this, and therefore can be discredited in this. And I think sometimes people on the left, especially obviously in the 9/11 truth movement, have to be careful because there are some of those people out there. There's one around here. Okay.
Here being Champaign-Urbana.
Champaign-Urbana, who implicates Jews in the 9/11 truth movement. And so there are some lines here. But again, the reason Israel stays front and center and sort of in this context is that I think it's always implied that when you are a conspiracy theorist, you are sort of a borderline or closet, or maybe out of the closet, anti-Semite.
We might put these issues too, the Gary Webb story and the question of what the CIA has done and does do. I mean, this drug connection runs back before even there was a CIA. The famous French connection that brought heroin into the United States more than a generation ago was established by the American government at the end of the Second World War, when we had to destroy what essentially were the French labor unions that had been involved in the resistance against the Germans and were concentrated in the port of Marseille. What the U.S. did, and this was the U.S. Army primarily, what the U.S. did was recruit the local mafia to break up these union demonstrations, these union organizing drives that were trying to get French shipping organized in a pro-labor fashion. The mafia was given the free rein to break up these unions by the U.S. government, and in return, they were allowed to ship heroin to the United States. That was the French connection that also made a movie. These things often turn up in movies, but so twisted, so badly presented and so forth, that the real story is very difficult to get at.
Was that the case for that movie?
Yeah, it was. That's what the French. Yes, that's where
But I didn't. I just didn't know whether the movie was an accurate. Was it as a useful historically anyway, or whether it distorted, whether people got the wrong idea or the right idea out of watching that movie? That
film, which was a long time ago, I mean, the film was made in the 70s, I think, was about the established French connection, the route that took drugs from France and into the United States, hence the French connection. It didn't really talk about how it had been established. In fact, that's not something we talk about very much at all in American history. The way in which American government agencies have used the drug business for its own purposes. That's what Webb was on about, and his is not the only example. We should also mention here, even more importantly, that none of this would make any sense at all if it weren't for the war on drugs. The war on drugs, which itself is a means of social control. That's its primary purpose. We have fascinating counterexamples today of countries, Portugal is the leading one, that have essentially decriminalized drugs and have much greater success in dealing with actual questions of addiction. The war on drugs in the United States is not designed to deal with questions of addiction. The war on drugs is designed to put people in jail, and it's very successful at it. The United States has more people, more of its fellow citizens. We have more of our fellow citizens in jail than any other country in the world. The war on drugs is working very nicely. Thank you. You're watching Aware on the Air. You were watching News from Neptune. We do another program here on UPTV called Aware on the Air, and I sometimes get them confused. News from Neptune, David Johnson, David Green, and Carl Estabrook talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media. I want to mention something, or at least ask you, gentlemen, about one aspect that has come up this week in these last couple of minutes. I've been involved in an argument with about Democratic front groups, notably MoveOn.org, which began specifically as a Democratic front group in the Clinton administration. The notion was that instead of impeaching Clinton as we should move on from these difficulties and go on about the Democratic Party's failed purposes. MoveOn.org today remains a ostensibly liberal organization that organizes petitions on public questions. Recently, a number of their petitions have essentially been in support, of the president's war policy. They've always been in support of the Democratic president, is, as I say, a Democratic front group. But the notion that Obama's war in the Middle East, and there's really only one war that Obama has been prosecuting in the Middle East since he became president. It's taken on various forms and in various countries in the Middle East. The present form is the war against ISIS, the caliphate. It's the same war for the same purposes, but the Move On organization right now is garnering support for the president's war policy in a sort of roundabout and underhanded way. Promoting resolutions in Congress saying Congress should vote in favor of allowing the president to carry on his war only for a limited time, or with no American boots on the ground, the current cliche. These are ostensibly limitations of Obama's war, but of course they're supports for Obama's war. And I think the old line is hypocrisy is a tribute that vice plays to virtue. Hypocrisy on these Democratic front groups in garnering support for the president's war grows out of the fact that they know that support for the war is very weak in the United States, in spite of all the propaganda about the viciousness of the new Sunni group in Iraq and Syria. So it seems to me there's a question here that needs to be discussed in more detail than we have time for this evening. But it's been on my mind.
But and it's just I liked Kathy Kelly's column about this.
Yes.
About peace that you can look up on Counterpunch.
Recommend it highly.
And just to say that the only moral approach to these problems is to look at the influence the United States has in the Middle East with its allies, its primary allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia. Stop demonizing Iran. The United States can make peace in the region if it chooses to do so, if the people make our government do so. And everything else is just more war.
Too true. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 43rd week of 2014, a Bottle Up the Genie edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and David Johnson, our own David project here. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett, and a reminder once again of David Johnson's program on WEFT radio at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning and on UPTV at 4 p.m. on Sunday afternoon. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.